Off this new unit, we're going to start with Manifest Destiny, Roman numeral 1. The years for this lecture is 1841 to 1848, and when you think of the 1840s, you think about Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny, as you can see reflected in the picture, is the idea that Americans believed God had chosen us. It's our destiny to go from sea to shining sea, to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, east to west, as you see in the picture. Americans believed that our culture was superior, and so we should spread it around the continent of North America. If you look right in the very middle of the picture, you see a cross because some pioneers had died, but religion plays a very important part in Manifest Destiny. Again, it's a belief that God has chosen Americans to go to the Pacific. There's also a racial component to Manifest Destiny. Americans at this time believed that white people were superior, and there was really nobody out west because Native Americans were inferior to white people, and they believed that they weren't using the land, and so it was just open and free for Americans to come and settle and farm, and so that they were chosen by God to bring their superior civilization, economy, and race to the west. So our stories of Manifest Destiny begins with Texas. Texas, in the 1820s, Texas was a part of the country of Mexico. In 1821, the Mexicans gained their independence from Spain. Spain had been weakened. We had talked about that from the Napoleonic Wars in previous lectures. And so Mexico is a brand new country. And if you look at the map, you can see that Mexico is taking up what you might consider the western third of the present United States. Since Mexico is brand new, they're broke, paying for their independence movement, and so they don't have a lot of money. So they start encouraging Americans from the south to move into northern Mexico in an area we currently call Texas. They wanted them to move in because these Americans would bring in their land. They would bring in money, they would bring in labor, they would help develop the region and keep it secure for the country of Mexico. The problem is that so many Americans are going to be drawn in that the Mexicans are going to get a little nervous about having too many Americans crossing the border. Mostly the reason the Americans are coming into what will be Texas is because eastern Texas is very humid, very wet, and so you can grow cotton there. As we've talked about in the previous unit, Americans want to grow cotton. There's a large market for cotton in the Northeast and in England at this time. So thousands and thousands of Americans move in from the south into northern Mexico or Texas, and they bring their slaves with them, and they start planting cotton on their plantations. So, since so many Americans are coming in, the Mexicans are afraid that if too many Americans move in, they will eventually at some point take Texas away from Mexico and have it join the United States, which of course is actually what happens at the end of our story. And so Mexico decided to pass some new laws. The first thing that they were going to do is they passed a law that says that no more Americans can come in to Texas. There's too many already. Like I said, they think it's a threat, and so they outlawed further immigration. Of course, Americans ignore this, and they keep now crossing the border illegally into Mexico, so the government of Mexico is upset about all of these illegal immigrants coming in from the United States. The next thing they do is they outlaw slavery. Mexico had outlawed slavery in the rest of Mexico, but in Texas before, they were kind of turning a blind eye to it because they wanted Americans to move in. Now they don't, and so they say, Mexico is a country that outlaws slavery, and we don't want it anymore. And they did this because they would hope that they would kind of stop the desire for Americans to move into Texas because they couldn't bring their slaves in anymore. Of course, once again, the Americans just ignore that, and they continue to bring in slaves and use slaves on their plantations. So because of this friction between the government of Mexico and all of these Americans living in Texas, the Texans decide to rebel. So the government of Mexico sends an army up to force the Americans to stop using slavery and to keep more Americans from coming into Texas. And the Texans, the Americans in Texas, rebel. We have the famous Battle of the Alamo, where some Americans who are rebelling against Mexico, they get cornered. As you can see in the bottom right-hand picture, they get cornered in this mission in San Antonio at the Alamo, and they're completely surrounded and killed to the last man. So that was a bad start for the Texas Revolution. But then later on, the Texans, with plenty of American help, will win the war at the Battle of San Jacinto. Forgive my poor Spanish. And at that point, then, the Texans are going to win their independence from Mexico. Texas will then become an independent state, its own country. Sometimes it's called the Lone Star Republic or the Lone Star State because for about 10 years, Texas is going to be its own country, not the United States, not part of Mexico. Of course, immediately after they win their independence, the Americans in Texas, or we can just call them Texans now, they want to join America. After all, they came from America, they're proud of their American heritage, and so they asked the United States, would you please make us a state in the United States? So that's the big question. Should America let Texas join the Union? Normally would think, yes, America wants to grow bigger at this time. It's our manifest destiny. God wants us to have Texas. He wants us to have all of North America. But there are of course, some people in the United States that don't want another southern state entering the Union. So then we go to number 2, debate over the admission of Texas. If you can see on this map, what I've done is I've numbered all of the free states in the United States and all of the slave states. And what we see is at the current time, when Texas is asking to become a state, there are 14 free states and 13 slave states, and so the free states are dominating in the United States Senate. So you can see why the South is so interested in getting Texas to come into the country, because that'll give them sectional balance in the Senate, and they believe that then slavery will be safe throughout the entire country. If you remember, the South is hypersensitive about slavery. They don't trust the government. They think that a strong federal government could eventually someday pass a law getting rid of slavery, and so if the South has an equal number of states in the Senate that the North does, that they would be able to block any possible legislation getting rid of slavery. So the admission of Texas is heavily supported in the South. So in the election of 1844, you see on the bottom left-hand corner, this will become a major issue in the election of 1844. Americans in the South are heavily advocating. They want a candidate who's going to promise them to bring Texas into the Union. And of course, Northerners don't want this. The Northerners understand that the South is dominating the economy of the United States at this point. King Cotton. They know that the Southerners have a lot of power in the federal government, and they fear that a slaveocracy is going to happen if we allow Texas to join the Union. Slaveocracy, as you can see in the bottom of the slide, that is the fear that the slave states will start controlling America, that they will make the government weaker, that they will not let us pass tariffs, they will do things that just benefit the South and not the North. And of course we see this as an example of, once again, sectionalism rising up in America. So eventually, at the election of 1844 happens, we'll talk about that in a future slide, and the candidate who's promising to bring Texas in as a slave state, he wins, and so Texas does come in as a slave state, so we now have sectional balance in the Senate. We have 14 free states, 14 slave states. You can see it represented on the map. Of course, we're not exactly sure where the southern boundary of Texas is with Mexico, which will, of course, will lead to future problems with the government of Mexico. The next part of manifest testing we're going to talk about is Section B, Oregon. So Oregon is in what we, of course, today call the Pacific Northwest, and if you remember from a previous lecture, Americans have claim to Oregon because Lewis and Clark traveled there seeking the Northwest Passage, and they went to the Pacific and said this is American territory, but the British had also been there. And so what we had done in the Treaty of 1818 is we had agreed to jointly occupy the Oregon Territory, which is a big territory, as you can see on the map in pink there, with the British. And this was not a problem. We were able to easily occupy Oregon jointly with the British because there just weren't that many white people moving out to Oregon until this point. However, this all changes with, you can see on the map, the Oregon Trail. As more and more Americans start to move west, this feeling of manifest destiny that we should have that land, we need that land, we find out the Oregon area is very good for farming. There's abundant rainfall, there's temperate climate. It seems like the promised land for farmers. And so we see thousands of farmers start to move out west in wagon trails on the Oregon Trail to get out there and to move into Oregon. Of course, at this point, this means that this is now going to be a problem. There's lots of Americans moving in. The British are starting to get concerned. They see all of these Americans moving in. They are fearful that America will just take the entire Oregon Territory away from the British. And so we have a debate with the British government. Where does the northern boundary of the Oregon Territory lie? And there are three different boundaries that we discuss with the British. The one that benefits America the most is the 54th parallel. You can see it's the one further north. It goes all the way up to what is present-day Alaska, the 5440 parallel. If that is the border between the United States and British Canada, then we might be able to carve 2, 3, 4 states out of that. And that is something that the free states in in the North would like. It means more farmland for northern farmers. But of course, this is going to be rejected by Southerners. If we could get 3 or 4 states out of the Oregon Territory, that'll give the North once again control of the Senate. And so Oregon becomes, as we have seen so many times, a sectional issue. Southerners certainly do not want the northern border of Oregon to be at 5440. They would much prefer the Columbia River, which you can see is the extreme southern border. If we make the border between us and Canada the Columbia River, then there's really only one state you can make out of that, which means that the South won't lose. They won't be so overwhelmed by northern free states in the Senate. And so the South is advocating for either no Oregon for the United States or a border at the Columbia River. Of course, this is what England wants too. They want the American portion of Oregon to be as small as possible. So we have these two different borders that we're talking about, 5440 or the Columbia River. And so once again, just like Texas, in the election of 1844, this becomes an issue. And the voters in the North, they want a candidate that's going to promise them a boundary at the 5440. In fact, there's even a phrase that goes on at this time among Northerners, 5440 or fight. So they're threatening to go to war with the British Empire for yet a third time if we don't get a bigger Oregon, an Oregon that goes all the way up into what will be Alaska. So we see this is a very contentious issue in the election of 1844. That election is going to be talking about manifest destiny. Should we get Texas? Should we get Oregon? If we get Oregon, how big should Oregon be? In reality, the dispute is going to be settled by not politicians so much as settlers. So many Americans come on the Oregon Trail into Oregon that the British know that they just can't hold on to the Oregon Territory. There's just so many Americans moving there that they understand that there's so few British there that eventually the Americans will win out. And so what we'll see is that the British and the Americans do reach an agreement as to where the boundary is going to be. So number 3, it says Oregon boundary becomes an issue in 1844. Once again, we see Oregon and Texas the main issues in the election of 1844. Should they come into America, where will the state lines be? So the election of 1844, we've talked about it a little bit now, so let's explore it some more in depth. The candidates for the election of 1844, the Democrats picked James Knox Polk. Not very many Americans know him. They should. He was the Speaker of the House, so he was the head Democrat in charge of the House of Representatives. He was also the governor of Tennessee. He is definitely what we would call a Westerner. Western Tennessee was still somewhat the frontier. And he did something smart, which politicians often do today. He went and he promised everything to everybody. So to get northern votes from the Democratic wing of the party, he says, look, we should get Oregon at the extreme northern border, 5440, which makes northern Democrats happy. Then he goes to the south and he says, and I promise that we will get Texas into the Union, which makes Southerners happy. And so he promised everything to everybody, and he's going to win the election as a result. Opposing him is our good friend Henry Clay, who still wants to be president. He's now run for a 4th time for being president. You can see from the picture he's pretty old at this point. And Henry Clay is a Whig, and his campaign slogan is Clay, Union, Liberty. Not a very catchy slogan, but you can see by his campaign slogan, his main things is he wants a strong federal government, he wants America to be united, that's the union part, and he certainly is promising people in the North to get Oregon as another free state. We can see that reflected in the liberty part. But this alienates Southern Whigs. They don't see that Henry Clay is really looking out for him. And what we're going to find out as a result of this election and the next election, Southerners do not feel like the Whig Party is really having their best interests at heart anymore. And the Whig Party is going to start to disintegrate over the question of slavery out west. So slavery is going to become an increasingly sectional issue, and it is going to eventually do away with the Whig Party. So I showed you this picture. This is a very famous picture from the time. It represents manifest destiny. So again, the election of 1844, just think of it as the manifest destiny election. We're struggling with the issues of Oregon and Texas and what should the boundary be. And so here we see this famous picture. Americans are led by God, by this angel who's moving us from east to west. And we're chasing away the Indians. You can see on the left-hand side of the picture. We're chasing away the buffalo herds. We're taking what white people considered land that has been vacant and useless, and now these farmers, they're going to turn it into productive land. We see people taking stagecoaches west. In the bottom right-hand corner, we see farmers moving west. We see in the direct foreground, we see prospectors are going to come out, and they're going to start to dig for precious metals in the West, and we see trains moving and telegraphs moving to the West. And so it captures the spirit that God has chosen Americans, white Americans, to capture the West because we are superior. We are superior racially. We are superior as a government. So we see Americans moving west. So the returns of the election. So if we look at this, we can see that James K. Polk wins the election. He certainly gets 62% of the electoral vote, so he does win. Popular vote-wise, it's a very close election. However, what we can see is definitely that the Democrats are strong in the deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. They're also strong in the trans-Mississippi West, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, etc. We see that the Whigs, they do have support in the Northeast, they do have some support in the West, but they are certainly a weakening party because of this issue of slavery. So our next president is James K. Polk. He is a very important president. Even though he only serves one term, America is certainly going to change significantly during his presidency. So if you remember when he was running for election, he promised that he would get Oregon for America, which of course made Northerners happy. However, he promised them that he would get the 54-40 parallel. He didn't do this, though. James K. Polk is a Southerner, and perhaps this made part of his decision, but he doesn't press England for the extreme northern limit of the Oregon Territory. Instead, he agrees with the British that we should extend the Treaty of 1818 line at the 49th parallel and just extend it west of the Pacific Ocean. It makes for a nice straight line, makes for an easy boundary, but it certainly is going to tick off the northern wing of the Democratic Party. And so we see over time the Democratic Party is going to be more and more associated with the South and less associated with the North. So just like the Whig Party is being torn apart by the issue of slavery, the Democratic Party is also being hampered and harmed by the issue of slavery. The Southerners certainly don't want Oregon to be as big as 54-40, and so they put pressure on James K. Polk to have a boundary that's not so far north. Now we're only going to get 2 or 3 states out of this instead of 4 or 5, giving the South a little bit more assurance that they will be able to at least stay close to the North in the Senate. So as you can see, we talked about Northern Democrats not being happy. So the next thing is Polk also wants California. Polk believes in manifest destiny. Not only did he get elected in the manifest destiny election, but he also, you can think of him as the manifest destiny president. He wants California, the extreme west coast of North America. If you could look at the map there, you can see that there are some wonderful ports in California. We have San Francisco, Long Beach, San Diego, Los Angeles, and so he believes that having California is essential for American success in the future. It's our manifest destiny to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Also, it has such great ports that we could start trading with China, we could start trading with Japan, we could dominate trade in the Pacific, and so he believes that it's our destiny to get California. The problem is that Mexicans own California. If you can see in the top right-hand corner, there are some Mexican families that have their roots going all the way back to when it was part of New Spain, and they have huge haciendas in California. It's very productive farmland. They have lots of wealth, lots of power, and they don't want to go from being controlled by Mexico to being controlled by the United States, because their fear is that if California is controlled by the United States, then Anglo-Americans, white Americans, will come in and steal their land from them, which of course they eventually will do. The other thing is that California has a lot of Native Americans that live in missions, that we've talked about, or in presidios around the Spanish settlements. And so the Native Americans there, either by choice or by force, are becoming Catholic, and they're forced to live around these missions. When we see a white America move in, this is not going to be good for Native Americans because, as we've seen in the past, white America believes that Native Americans, they should not live next to them. They should be forced to go on reservations or killed or pushed to some faraway place. So America wants California, but this is going to have negative effects on Native Americans and the Mexican Americans who live there. So James K. Polk sends John Slidell, he sends him to Mexico City, and he says, hey, Mexico, we're going to give you an offer. We're going to give you millions of dollars. It doesn't matter the amount. We're going to give you a decent offer, what we considered a decent offer for California. Now, of course, Mexico doesn't like this. They are angry with the United States for admitting Texas, which they still consider a rebellious province of Mexico. And so Mexico is nervous about the United States starting to gobble up land, and they're afraid that the United States will not be content with just Texas and California. They'll also want Colorado and Utah and etc. And so Mexico says no to the United States. We don't care how much money you're going to give us. We're not going to sell you California. Well, James K. Polk is not the man to take no for an answer. And so what we're going to see is the United States will acquire California, even though Mexico does not want to sell it to us. So that leads us right into the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. The Mexican-American War is going to be caused by, first, Texas. The United States and Mexico would disagree about the status of Texas. Even though Texas won their independence in the Texas Revolution, Mexico believes that it is not an independent state. They believe that it is just still a rebellious state and it's still part of Mexico. And so when the United States took Texas as part of a state, the Mexicans thought that this is unfair, that the United States is illegally occupying Texas. And so there's a bone of contention between the two countries. Who really owns Texas? The other thing is that even Mexico says even if Texas is a part of the United States, they have stolen a bunch of the land from Mexican citizens. When it became a state in the United States, white Americans moved in even bigger numbers, and they started gobbling up land and pushing Mexicans off their land. And so the government of Mexico says, look, even if it is a part of the United States, we want you to repay some of these Mexicans for the land you took out from under them. And the United States has refused to do this so far. Next, Mexico rejected the Slidell offer, and so there's more friction between the United States and Mexico. We're mad that they have the nerve to reject our offer, and the Mexicans are nervous and suspicious of us that we're not going to just be content with Texas. We're going to want California, and then, like I said, we're going to want the rest of the West. The final and the biggest reason that we see here for the Mexican-American War is America's belief in manifest destiny. We believe that God wants us to control the West, not Mexico, because we're a superior race, because we don't see the Mexicans using the land the way they should. They should turn it into farmland. They should mine it. They should not let Indians have it. And so we believe that since nobody's using it, it's our land, and God wants us to have it. There is one smaller reason, of course, is because the West can grow cotton. Today, there's lots of cotton grown in New Mexico and Arizona, and of course, Southerners want that land. They want more slave states for the Senate. They want to be able to have new land to grow their cotton. And so all four of these are reasons, major causes for the Mexican-American War. The problem is that Mexico won't fight us. Sir, we're having disagreements about where the boundary is between Texas. We're having disagreements about whether they should sell us California or not. But Mexico is not stupid. They're not going to start a war with the United States. We have many more people, lots more money, lots more industry. And so what we have to do is we have to provoke a war. So we have this dispute. We can see in the map, we see the Republic of Texas in solid orange, and then all of the orange stripes on the map you see is this disputed territory. Now, we say the boundary between Texas and Mexico proper is the Rio Grande, which is at the very bottom of the map where the orange stripes end. It's that river that now marks the present boundary of Texas and Mexico, and we say that that is the southern border of the United States. The Mexicans say, well, first of all, you don't own Texas at all, but even if you do, the border is a little bit further north. If you go up the coast a little bit, you can see another small river right at the edge of the Republic of Texas, and that's the Nueces River. And so that's where Mexico says the border between the United States and Mexico is. So we have this orange shaded area that's kind of no man's land. We both are claiming that area. And so what we do is we send troops in. James K. Polk sends troops into this disputed area, knowing full well that Mexico will consider this an invasion of their territory. We can say that no, we didn't invade Mexico. We're just sending troops into our own part of the country, and we are defending America. So the troops are right between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. Of course, the Mexicans attack us because they think we invaded Mexico. So now the United States can say to the world that we are declaring war against Mexico because not only does Mexico have the boundary wrong, but they went ahead and invaded the United States. They attacked American troops on American soil. And so President Polk asked for a declaration of war, and he gets it. So now we start the Mexican-American War in 1846. As we can see as a theme in this class, is that there are always not 100% support for American wars. During the American Revolution, we had loyalists who didn't support the war. During the Mexican-American War, we're going to have some transcendentalists who don't support the war. Here's our most famous one, Thoreau. We've talked about him before. And Thoreau believes that you should not follow the law. If you remember, he wrote the book Civil Disobedience, and he says if the law is unjust, then I say break the law. And so Thoreau says, this is an unjust war. Americans provoked the war. We put troops into the area that's disputed, and so America is to blame, and he refuses to pay his taxes. He says, I'm not going to spend my money to support a government that is fighting an unjust war. And so, of course, Thoreau goes to jail for this. So Thoreau is a great example of protest in this war. Another great example of protest is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is a young politician at this point from Illinois. He just got elected to Congress. And Abraham Lincoln, he's also not in favor of this war. He believes that this war is maybe perhaps unjust. He believed that we, again, maybe had provoked it. And he also thinks that this war is going to give us more southern states. If you can look at the map, again, we talked about how most of this territory that we will be adding if we fight Mexico, whether it's a bigger Texas, it is California, New Mexico, Arizona, you can grow cash crops on this land. And Abraham Lincoln certainly doesn't want slavery to expand. We'll talk more about that later. And so Abraham Lincoln stands up in the United States Congress and he says, I want to know exactly where this war started. Mr. Polk, President Polk, you had said that America was invaded by the Mexicans. I want to know the exact spot that they were invaded. Because if it is indeed in this disputed territory, I don't think that we should support this war. Now, this makes Lincoln, this is committing political suicide for Lincoln. Just about everybody in America wants to support this war except for these few protesters. And when Lincoln says, well, I don't know if this is really a legitimate war, it makes Lincoln seem unpopular and patriotic and weak. And so he's only going to serve one term in Congress, and he's going to then go back, and he says he's going to give up politics after that and just be a lawyer. And so we see Thoreau and Lincoln as a great example of political protest to this Mexican-American War. Fighting the war itself. So AP does not care a ton about battles and things like that, and so what we do is we just have one slide on the war itself. But as you can see on the map, there's going to be several different armies that we will send out west to conquer different parts of Mexico. When the war starts, we just, by coincidence, happen to have an American military officer in California when the war starts, completely away from American territory, deep into Mexico, into California. His name is John C. Fremont, and according to the American government, he was in California on a scientific expedition with a bunch of soldiers who are armed. And so when the war starts, he is able to use a small group of American soldiers to encourage the Americans who are currently living in California, they got there through the Oregon Trail, to rebel against the government of Mexico. And for a brief time, California is going to be, just like Texas, its own independent country. It's called the Bear Flag Revolt, or the Bear Flag Republic. You can see their picture on the map. And again, we see the single star because California, for a few months, is going to be their own independent country. As soon as John C. Fremont got the Americans to rebel, they declared themselves an independent state. So the United States, no matter how this war ends, is going to eventually get California. But then we see that the United States sends generals in to fight battles at San Antonio, so we're going to get New Mexico. But the biggest action happens down deep in Mexico itself. We send an army down under General Winfield Scott to attack Mexico City, the capital of Mexico itself. They march up to Mexico City and they take the capital. So at that point the war is over, and the war really only lasts from 1846 to 1847, 1 year. The United States just has way too many people, too much money for the Mexicans, too much industrialization, and it was a pretty lopsided affair. In fact, most of the Americans who die in the war don't die from American bullets, they die from disease, dysentery, things that affect the Americans and kill off Americans much more than Mexican bullets. We are going to get a series of also of heroes, and we know what we like to do to generals who become heroes in war. They become presidents. So we will talk about Zachary Taylor. He is going to experience several victories in this war, and eventually we are going to make him a president as well. So the war ends. In 1848, we finally settle the war, and we sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. You can see it spelled on the map. At the treaty, the United States is going to take everything that is in kind of that middle color gray on the map. Texas was already made part of the United States. Now that boundary is going to be settled. It's the Rio Grande. And so from this war, we're going to get all of California, New Mexico, Utah, the western part of Colorado, the western part of New Mexico, and most of what is current-day Arizona. It is going to significantly increase the size of the United States by a third. It's also going to take away the northern third of the government of Mexico. So this is a major land addition for the United States. So under James K. Polk's administration, remember I told you to call him Mr. Manifest Destiny, the United States is now going to go from sea to shining sea. So the terms of the treaty, like I said, we can tick this off as we go through the list. Texas is now definitely part of the United States with the border of Rio Grande. The United States is going to get a bunch of land, which we've already talked about. The United States, oddly enough, is going to pay Mexico. Even though we win the war, we might feel a little bit guilty about this. So before, under the Slidell offer, we were going to give Mexico $15 million for California. Now we decide we're going to give them $10 million for all of these states in the middle shade of gray. Normally this doesn't happen in world history. When a country wins a war, they make the people who lose pay, but perhaps we felt a little bit of guilt. Now, of course, not everybody is going to be for this, so there is some opposition to this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the opposition comes from Southerners. Southerners think that this treaty doesn't go far enough. After all, we did capture Mexico City, and so the Southerners want all of Mexico, not just the northern third, but the entire country of Mexico. Think of all the southern states you can make out of that. All of it can be used to grow cotton or other cash crops, and think of all the southern states in the Senate. This would give the South firm control over the United States Senate and expand slavery. But we don't do that because the North would not support that. The North does not want a whole bunch of southern slave states. So once again, this issue of slavery in the Western territories becomes an issue. Sectionalism rears its ugly head. So the impact of the war on the United States. The war did cost 13,000 Americans their lives. As I had said, a lot of that comes from disease that happened when the Army was moving a large amount of men, or food poisoning and so forth and so on. It also is going to give the United States a bad image among Latino countries in the Western Hemisphere. Going back to the Monroe Doctrine, Latin countries thought the United States was a good neighbor. We said that we would protect Latin America from European colonization. We said that we have a lot in common with Latin America. We fought against European countries for independence, so did they. And so we got along pretty well with our Latin American neighbors. But from this point on, that will not be the case. Latin America is going to start to look at the United States as a greedy, imperialistic power who wants to take as much land in the Western Hemisphere as possible. We'll talk about that more in future lectures. Next, we're also going to talk about the Wilmot Proviso. When the United States was fighting the war, Mr. Wilmot in Congress stood up and he proposed that whatever land we get in this war will be free land. Obviously, Wilmot is a northerner. Of course, this goes nowhere. Most of the people who fought in the Mexican-American War were Southerners because they're just closer to the front, and they were also hoping to get a bunch of southern slave states out of this war. And so why are we talking about this Wilmot Proviso, this idea that whatever land we get will be free land? Because it's an example of sectionalism once again. During the war, while we're fighting the war, Northerners and Southerners are disagreeing about what will these new territories be. Will they be free or slave? And so we see a pattern in American history now. If you remember, right after the American Revolution, we were trying to decide what to do with the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, free or slave. And Congress came up with the Northwest Ordinance and the Ohio River as a boundary. Then when we had the Louisiana Purchase, what should that be, free or slave? And we came up with the Missouri Compromise. We're going to divide the land between free and slave. And now that we've added the Mexican, what we call cession, the Mexican cession is all the land you see in this kind of taupe color on the map that we've gotten from the Mexican-American War. The question comes up again. Should the land we add out west be free or slave? And AP1 should understand that these two issues are tied together. Every time we move west, it forces the issue of slavery in the United States. Should that land be free or slave? And so we see, again, sectionalism. The last thing we have on this slide is that Americans who fight in the war are going to gain valuable experience. There are young Army officers who are going to get introduced to the idea of how do you control men in combat? How do you get them to be in the right place at the right time? And so a whole young generation of Army officers are going to cut their teeth in the warfare in this war. We have a young, at the bottom, we see Ulysses S. Grant, who will be the #1 general for the North in the Civil War, about in 20 years. And then we'll see a young Robert E. Lee, who's on top here. And all of these men will form lifelong bonds with one another, and they will learn how to conduct troops in battle. But of course, when the Civil War begins, these friendships that they made in the Mexican-American War will be torn apart as they now are fighting each other instead of on the same side.